Vivian Ashford found out she had been removed from the guest list of the Larchmont Museum's annual gala, the same way she found out about most of her husband's decisions that year. By accident, 3 weeks before the event, when a friend on the museum's board mentioned, in an entirely unrelated conversation, how much she was looking forward to seeing Vivian and Philip's new associate at the head table together. Vivian did not correct her. She simply said she would check her calendar, and then she went home and confirmed, within 20 minutes, that her name had in fact been quietly removed from the seating chart and replaced with a woman she had never met. Philip Ashford had been having an affair with Sloane Whitaker, a junior associate at his law firm, for 9 months by the time the gala invitations went out, and had made, in the weeks before the event, a specific and calculated decision that the Larchmont Gala, a black tie event he had attended at Vivian's side for over a decade, would be the place where he finally, publicly, began introducing Sloane into the social life he intended to eventually replace his marriage with. What Philip did not fully understand, because he had spent 17 years treating Vivian's relationship with the museum as a pleasant hobby rather than asking a single direct question about its actual scope, was that the gala he was planning to walk into with his mistress could not, in any practical sense, happen without his wife's money. This is the story of what happens when a man spends 17 years married to a woman whose actual significance he never bothered to understand, and what happened when Vivian Ashford, instead of staying home the night of the gala, decided to walk through the front doors anyway, not as a guest who had been quietly uninvited, but as someone with every legitimate reason in the world to be standing in that room. It is also the story of exactly what happened to the room's conversation, in real time, the moment people began to understand who, precisely, had just walked in. Vivian had decided what she was going to do about the missing invitation within the first 10 minutes of confirming it was true. She did not tell Philip. She did not tell most of her own friends. The one person she told, 3 weeks before the gala, was Dr. Harold Fenwick, and what she asked him to do is the part of this story most people retelling it get completely wrong. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we get to what Vivian actually asked Harold to do, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything in this story is really an answer to one of them. First, how significant was Vivian's relationship with the Larchmont Museum, really? Philip understood, in the vaguest possible terms, that his wife was involved with the museum, attended events, sat on a committee, had opinions about paintings. What he never understood, because he never asked a single specific question in 17 years, was the actual scale and history of what that involvement represented. We're going to show you exactly what Vivian built, quietly, over the past decade. Second, what did Vivian actually ask Harold Fenwick to do? This isn't a story about Vivian storming into a building and demanding to be let in. She had a specific, careful conversation with the museum's executive director 3 weeks before the event, and what she asked him for tells you almost everything about who Vivian actually is and how she chose to handle one of the worst betrayals of her life. And third, what happened in the room the moment people understood who had just walked in. There is no shouting in this story. Vivian did not make a scene. What happened instead, in the specific minutes after her arrival, was something considerably quieter and considerably more devastating than a confrontation. And it happened almost entirely without her saying a word. Sloane Whitaker had been told, by Philip, that his wife was not really involved in his life anymore and would have no reason to attend an event like this. Sloane had no idea, walking into that gala on Philip's arm, exactly how completely wrong that description was about to be proven. Vivian Ashford spent her 20s and early 30s working as a curatorial assistant and later associate curator at the Larchmont Museum of Fine Arts, specializing in 19th and early 20th century American painting, work she found genuinely consuming and meaningful, and that gave her, by the time she left the museum staff at 34 to start a family, a depth of institutional knowledge and personal relationships within the museum's leadership that few people outside the curatorial world ever fully understood the value of. Vivian's departure from the museum's paid staff was never a departure from the institution itself. She remained closely connected through informal advisory relationships with successive curatorial teams, eventually formalizing that connection through a position on the museum's acquisitions committee, a role she has held continuously for over a decade, and that gives her direct input into some of the institution's most significant purchasing decisions. This early, substantive professional history is essential to understanding everything that followed. Vivian's later significance to the museum was never primarily about money, even though the money would eventually become considerable. It began, and in her own estimation always remained, primarily about expertise, relationships, and a genuine institutional commitment that simply happened to be reinforced, over time, by substantial financial contribution as well. That foundation, built years before she ever met Phillip, would prove to be the single most important fact in understanding exactly what walked through the museum's doors on the night of the gala. Vivian met Phillip Ashford at a mutual friend's dinner party during her final year on the museum's paid staff, where Phillip, then a rising associate at a prestigious corporate law firm, struck her as confident, articulate, and genuinely curious about her work, in a way she found refreshing compared to several previous relationships where her career had registered, at best, as a pleasant conversational topic rather than something anyone wanted to understand in depth. Friends of the early relationship have consistently described Phillip as attentive to Vivian's work during the courtship and the first several years of marriage, regularly attending museum openings and lectures alongside her, a level of engagement that gradually diminished, by multiple accounts, not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow, ordinary erosion of curiosity that sometimes accompanies the accumulation of a long marriage's daily logistics and competing professional demands. Phillip proposed after 2 years of dating, and Vivian left the museum's paid staff roughly 18 months into the marriage, a transition both of them, at the time, described and genuinely understood as a mutual decision to focus on building their family, a framing that remained largely accurate, even as Vivian's continued, increasingly significant relationship with the museum operated in a register Phillip never fully tracked. That gap between what Phillip assumed Vivian's museum involvement represented and what it actually represented would widen steadily and almost entirely invisibly over the following 15 years. Vivian's financial contributions to the Larchmont Museum began modestly in the early years of the marriage, funded largely through her own family inheritance rather than joint marital assets, a distinction that would later matter considerably to how her involvement was legally and financially understood. Over the following decade, as that inheritance was managed and grown through investments largely separate from the couple's joint finances, Vivian's capacity for, and pattern of, significant annual giving to the museum increased steadily, culminating roughly 6 years before the gala in a transformational gift that funded the complete renovation of the museum's American painting wing. That renovation gift, structured through a private family trust Vivian's own attorney managed entirely separately from any joint account or asset Phillip had visibility into, totaled just over $11 million, making Vivian, by a considerable margin, the single largest individual donor in the Larchmont Museum's history, and earning her a permanent, formal seat on the museum's board of trustees, a position she has held for 6 years. Phillip attended the wing's reopening celebration at the time, 6 years before the gala, and has since acknowledged, according to people close to the marriage, that he understood it as a significant and generous gift, but never connected it, in any sustained way, to a broader picture of Vivian's actual financial independence, or her formal institutional standing, treating the gift, in his own later words, as something Vivian cared about rather than evidence of anything specific about her overall significance to the institution. This specific gap between a single visible act of generosity and the broader, sustained pattern of significance it represented is the precise failure of curiosity that would eventually determine how catastrophically wrong Phillip's assumptions turned out to be. Friends and family of the marriage have described a gradual but unmistakable pattern over its final 5 years, in which Phillip's attention to Vivian's professional and intellectual life diminished steadily, replaced by a kind of passive, generic supportiveness, attending museum events when his schedule allowed, offering brief and increasingly interchangeable praise for whatever Vivian happened to be working on, without engaging with the specific substance of any of it in the way he had during the marriage's early years. Renata Okonkwo-Price, Vivian's closest friend and a fellow museum board member, has described several specific instances over the final 2 years of the marriage in which Phillip, at social gatherings, introduced Vivian to new acquaintances, using language that notably understated her actual role at the museum, describing her, on more than one occasion, simply as someone who volunteers at the museum or is on some committee there, framing that Renata found increasingly jarring given that she herself, as a fellow board member, understood precisely how central and substantial Vivian's actual position had become. Vivian has said, in limited subsequent comments, that she noticed this diminishing engagement, but largely attributed it, for years, to the ordinary pressures of a demanding legal career and the natural settling of a long marriage, rather than to anything more specifically troubling, an interpretation she has since had to substantially revise. That interpretation became impossible to sustain roughly 9 months before the gala, when Phillip began a relationship with a junior associate at his firm named Sloane Whitaker. Phillip's relationship with Sloane Whitaker, a 34-year-old associate at his firm, began approximately 9 months before the gala, developing through extended hours on a major litigation matter and escalating, over the following months, into a relationship that several colleagues at the firm had begun to quietly notice, well before Vivian herself learned anything was wrong. As the relationship progressed, Phillip made a deliberate, calculated decision, according to a colleague he discussed it with at the time, that the Larchmont Gala, a high-visibility social event he had attended for over a decade, and one Sloane, by her own account, had expressed genuine interest in attending given the institution's prominence, represented an appropriate, low-risk opportunity to begin introducing Sloane into a social context where, in Phillip's own assessment at the time, Vivian's actual presence and significance would be minimal enough not to create any real complication. This assessment, according to the same colleague, was based entirely on Phillip's long-standing but fundamentally incomplete understanding of what Vivian's relationship with the museum actually involved, an understanding that had never been updated in any serious way in the 6 years since the wing renovation, or in the years of board service that followed it. Phillip contacted the gala's event coordinator directly roughly 5 weeks before the event, requesting that the seating arrangement be updated to reflect Sloane Whitaker as his guest instead of Vivian Ashford, a request the event coordinator processed as a routine administrative change, with no understanding whatsoever of who, precisely, was being quietly removed from the room. Vivian's discovery, as described earlier, came through an entirely ordinary conversation with a fellow board member at a committee lunch, 3 weeks before the gala, a conversation Vivian has said she remembers with unusual clarity, specifically because of how unremarkable it felt in the moment. The board member mentioned looking forward to seeing Vivian and Phillip's new associate together at the head table, clearly under the impression that Sloane's attendance was already a known, settled fact within their social circle. Vivian has said she felt, in the moment, a specific kind of stillness rather than immediate devastation, a controlled clarity she attributed afterward to some quiet part of her having already absorbed, over the preceding months, enough small signals about Phillip's behavior that the news, however shocking in its specifics, did not arrive as a complete surprise about the underlying situation. She told the board member only that she would need to check her calendar, finished the lunch with no visible change in her demeanor, and confirmed the seating change herself within the hour by contacting the museum's events office directly. She has said the confirmation itself, seeing her own name removed and Sloane's name typed into the seating chart in its place, produced a different and more specific kind of pain than the general knowledge of an affair might have, a particular, concrete cruelty in being administratively erased from a room that, in ways Phillip had never fully understood, existed in its current form, substantially because of her. Vivian did not confront Phillip that day. She has said the decision not to was, unlike many of her decisions in the weeks that followed, not strategic so much as simply instinctive. She needed time to decide what she actually wanted to do before she said anything to him at all. Vivian called Dr. Harold Fenwick, the museum's executive director, 2 days after confirming the guest list change, requesting a private meeting that she characterized, in her initial message, only as a personal matter she wanted to discuss with him directly, rather than through any formal board channel. Vivian told Harold, according to his own later account, the full situation plainly, that her husband had quietly removed her from the gala's guest list to make room for the woman he was having an affair with, and that she had decided, after several days of consideration, that she intended to attend the gala anyway, in her full and accurate capacity as a museum trustee, and major benefactor, rather than allow herself to be erased from an institution she had spent over 2 decades building a genuine relationship with. Harold has said his immediate response was a mixture of personal sympathy and, almost simultaneously, a kind of professional clarity about the situation. As a trustee and the institution's largest individual donor, Vivian had every legitimate right to attend the gala regardless of any private seating arrangement Phillip had separately requested, and the only practical question was how to handle the evening's logistics smoothly without creating an unnecessarily public spectacle that might reflect poorly on the museum itself. What Vivian asked Harold to do specifically, in that conversation, was not to intervene dramatically or to confront Phillip on her behalf. It was something considerably more restrained and considerably more devastating in its eventual effect. Vivian asked Harold for 2 specific things. First, that her name and her formal title as a museum trustee be properly reflected on her place card and in the evening's printed program, exactly as it would have been had no seating change ever occurred, rather than any kind of special or conspicuous arrangement that might read as deliberately engineered for confrontation. Second, that Harold personally greet her at the entrance when she arrived, in the same way he would greet any trustee attending the event, an ordinary courtesy that Vivian specifically wanted to ensure happened visibly, in the entrance area, where the largest number of arriving guests would naturally be present to witness it. Vivian has said, in limited subsequent comments about her own reasoning, that she did not want her presence at the gala to look engineered or theatrical in any way. She wanted it to look exactly like what it actually was, a trustee and major donor attending an event she had every ordinary right to attend, greeted with the same institutional courtesy any trustee would receive, allowing the room's own collective recognition of who she actually was to do whatever communicating needed to be done, without requiring her to say or do anything dramatic herself. Harold agreed to both requests without hesitation, and has since described Vivian's specific framing of what she wanted: visibility through ordinary institutional courtesy rather than any kind of staged confrontation, as entirely consistent with the careful, understated way she had always conducted herself in her relationship with the museum throughout the entire decade he had known her. Vivian spent the following 3 weeks doing something else. Most people retelling this story tend to skip entirely. She did not tell Phillip anything about her plans, continued behaving with him exactly as she had for the preceding several months, and quietly began, in parallel, the first conversations with her own attorney about what the eventual end of the marriage was likely to involve. Vivian has described the 3 weeks between her conversation with Harold and the gala itself as among the most internally turbulent of her adult life, even as her outward behavior with Phillip remained, by every account, almost entirely unchanged. A deliberate choice, she has said, was partly strategic, to avoid tipping Phillip off to her plans before the gala, and partly simply the only way she found she could continue functioning day to day while privately processing the end of a 17-year marriage. Beyond her conversation with Harold, Vivian quietly retained a divorce attorney recommended by Renata, beginning preliminary, confidential conversations about the practical realities of ending the marriage, conversations that proceeded entirely separately from anything Phillip was aware of. She also, during this period, spent considerable time at the museum itself, in the galleries she had helped fund and shape over the preceding decade, time she has described as genuinely restorative in a period when very little else in her life felt stable. Renata has said Vivian's composure throughout this period was genuine rather than performed, attributing it to a specific quality she had always admired in her friend: a tendency to do the difficult internal work of processing pain privately and thoroughly, before ever allowing any public response to take shape, rather than reacting from the immediate, less considered emotion of the initial discovery. That careful 3-week preparation is exactly what made the gala itself unfold the way it did, not as an explosive confrontation, but as something considerably quieter and considerably more difficult for Phillip to recover from. Phillip and Sloane arrived at the Larchmont Gala together on the evening of the event, by every account from people present, in genuinely high spirits, with Sloane, according to a colleague who spoke with her beforehand, visibly excited about attending an event of this prominence, and, by her own later account, operating entirely under Phillip's earlier characterization that his wife was not really involved in his life anymore and would have no particular reason or standing to attend. The first 90 minutes of the gala proceeded, by every account, In an atmosphere of comfortable, confident normalcy for Phillip and Sloane, who moved through the cocktail reception together, were introduced to several of Phillip's professional acquaintances without incident and gave no indication, in their own demeanor, of any awareness that anything unusual was about to unfold. That comfortable normalcy ended the moment Vivian Ashford walked through the museum's main entrance, exactly as Harold Fenwick had agreed to receive her, roughly 90 minutes into the event. Vivian arrived at the museum's main entrance alone, dressed elegantly but not ostentatiously, and was greeted at the door by Harold Fenwick personally, exactly as planned, a greeting that included Harold using her full formal title, welcoming Trustee Ashford warmly and audibly, in a manner entirely consistent with how he would greet any major donor arriving at a significant institutional event. Museum staff near the entrance, accustomed to Vivian's regular presence at the institution and her formal trustee status, greeted her with the kind of familiar, deferential warmth typical of how staff treat a long-standing, deeply respected board member, a level of recognition that several guests near the entrance, who had no idea of the personal situation involved, found visibly notable simply because of how warmly and immediately Vivian was received compared to the more generic greetings other arriving guests had experienced. It was this specific, ordinary institutional warmth, more than anything else, that began the chain of recognition spreading through the entrance area. Guests who knew Phillip professionally, but did not previously understand the full scope of Vivian's role, began asking each other, quietly, exactly who the woman receiving such personal attention from the museum's executive director actually was. A question that, within minutes, reached someone who immediately recognized Vivian's name from the American Painting Wing's donor plaque. Phillip, standing near the center of the gallery with Sloane at that exact moment, had no idea his wife had even arrived until the specific quality of the room's attention shifted in a way he found impossible not to notice. Phillip, by his own later account, noticed the shift in the room's attention before he understood its cause, a sensation he described as similar to a sudden, unexplained change in temperature. He turned toward the entrance and saw Vivian, standing near the museum's main reception area, engaged in warm, easy conversation with Harold Fenwick and two senior board members who had approached to greet her, a tableau that told him, within seconds, exactly what had happened and exactly how badly his earlier assumption about her likely absence had failed. Sloane, standing beside Phillip, asked him quietly who the woman near the entrance was, not yet understanding the situation. Phillip's response, according to a colleague standing nearby who overheard the exchange, was a brief, visibly strained explanation that the woman was Vivian, a response that left Sloane, by her own later account, confused rather than immediately alarmed, since Phillip had described his wife to her, repeatedly, as someone with minimal social presence or institutional standing. That confusion resolved into something considerably more serious within the following several minutes, as Sloane began overhearing fragments of nearby conversation referencing Vivian's formal trustee title, her connection to the American Painting Wing, and her broader significance to the institution. Details that contradicted, point by point, everything Phillip had previously told her about his wife's relevance to his life and his social world. Vivian, for her part, made no move toward Phillip or Sloane at any point during the evening. She did not need to. The room was already doing, on its own, everything that needed to be communicated. Over the following half hour, according to multiple accounts from guests present, conversation throughout the gallery shifted noticeably, with clusters of guests quietly discussing what they were piecing together about Vivian's actual significance to the institution. Several specifically referencing the American Painting Wing renovation and openly speculating, in hushed tones, about what Vivian's clearly unplanned but entirely legitimate presence implied about the situation between her and Phillip. Vivian and Phillip did exchange a brief, polite greeting at one point during the evening, when their paths crossed near the silent auction tables, and exchanged two nearby guests described as outwardly civil but unmistakably tense, with Vivian asking him, evenly and without any visible anger, whether he and Sloane were enjoying the evening, a question Phillip answered with a single strained word before the encounter ended, and both parties moved in separate directions. Several guests who witnessed this exchange described it, afterward, as more unsettling to observe than any direct confrontation might have been, specifically because Vivian's complete composure, combined with everything the room had already pieced together about her actual standing, made unmistakably clear that Phillip's earlier assumption about her irrelevance had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly wrong, in front of exactly the social and professional community whose opinion mattered most to him. Vivian remained at the gala for the remainder of the evening, engaging warmly with fellow board members and museum staff, and left, by her own choice, before the event's formal conclusion, a departure several guests later described as quietly, deliberately graceful. The remainder of the gala proceeded, by every account, in a noticeably different register than its first 90 minutes, with conversation among guests dominated by speculation about exactly what Vivian's appearance meant, what had actually happened between her and Phillip, and what it suggested about the relationship Phillip had so visibly, and so recently, begun introducing into the same social world. Several guests at the gala were partners or senior colleagues at Phillip's own law firm, a detail that ensured the story reached his professional circle considerably faster than it might have in a less interconnected social world, with multiple firm colleagues independently confirming, in the days following the gala, that the evening had become a significant topic of quiet office conversation, considerably complicating the discretion Phillip and Sloane had previously maintained around their relationship. By the time the gala formally ended, the story had already begun circulating well beyond the room itself, shared among the museum's broader donor and social community, and within Phillip's professional circle, a combination that made the story considerably more resonant and more difficult for Phillip to manage than a similar situation might have been in a less interconnected world. Sloane's reaction to everything she learned that night, and in the days that followed, would become, according to people who know her, the most significant turning point in how she understood not just her relationship with Phillip, but her own choices leading up to it. Sloane has described the days following the gala as among the most disorienting of her adult life, not primarily because of any practical professional consequence, though those would eventually follow, but because the experience forced her to examine, with a clarity she had previously avoided, exactly how completely she had accepted Phillip's characterization of his marriage and his wife, without ever once independently verifying any of it. Sloane told a close friend, in a conversation referenced afterward, that she had genuinely believed throughout the relationship Phillip's repeated framing of his marriage as essentially over in every meaningful sense beyond the legal formality, and that discovering how significant, respected, and clearly still socially connected Vivian actually was made her question, for the first time, whether Phillip's account of his marriage's condition had ever been fully honest, or whether it had simply been the version most convenient for him to tell her. She has said the specific detail that stayed with her longest was not Vivian's wealth or institutional standing itself, but the quiet warmth with which museum staff and board members had greeted her. A warmth that suggested a woman who was still, by every visible measure, deeply and genuinely embedded in a rich, ongoing life, directly contradicting Phillip's repeated insistence that Vivian had become socially isolated and increasingly absent from anything resembling a shared life with him. Sloane's relationship with Phillip did not end immediately after the gala. It ended instead after a specific conversation roughly 5 weeks later that several people close to the situation have described as the real conclusion of this entire story. Phillip contacted Vivian 3 days after the gala, requesting a conversation he characterized, in his initial message, as an attempt to figure out where things actually stand between them, a message Vivian has said struck her as remarkable, primarily for how completely it avoided any direct acknowledgement of what had actually happened at the gala itself. Vivian agreed to a single meeting, held at the couple's home rather than any neutral location, specifically because she had already decided, by that point, exactly what she intended to communicate, and preferred to do so somewhere she would not need to manage the additional discomfort of a public setting. Phillip, according to Vivian's account, opened the conversation by attempting to characterize the guest list change as a thoughtless mistake rather than a deliberate decision, a framing Vivian corrected immediately and without raising her voice, informing him that she had confirmed directly with the museum's events office that the change had been requested specifically and personally by him, by name, 5 weeks before the event. Phillip did not have an immediate response to this correction. Vivian has said the silence that followed was the moment she understood, with complete and final clarity, that there was no version of an apology or explanation he could offer that would change her decision about what came next. Vivian told Phillip, in that same conversation, that she had already begun the formal process of ending the marriage, and that she had made a separate, related decision about her relationship with the Larchmont Museum going forward, that she wanted him to understand clearly before any divorce proceedings began. Vivian told Phillip that she intended to significantly deepen her involvement with the Larchmont Museum going forward, beginning with a new, considerably larger planned gift she had already begun discussing privately with Harold Fenwick, a multi-year commitment to fund an entirely new curatorial fellowship program for early career museum professionals, structured specifically to support the kind of substantive, expertise-driven institutional career she herself had built decades earlier, before her own departure from paid museum work. Vivian has said the timing of this expanded commitment was not coincidental, but was not primarily about Phillip either. The events of the gala had clarified for her, she has said, exactly how much of her own identity and sense of purpose over the preceding decade had been quietly built around her relationship with the museum, largely invisible to her own husband, and she wanted to use the moment of the marriage's ending to invest more deliberately and visibly in the part of her life that had remained genuinely, consistently hers throughout the entire marriage. Harold Fenwick, when the fellowship program was formally announced roughly 4 months later, described Vivian's gift, in public remarks at the announcement, as reflecting a lifetime commitment to the kind of institutional knowledge and mentorship that built this museum in the first place, language that, several board members later noted, captured precisely the quality of Vivian's relationship with the institution that Phillip himself had never fully understood or valued. Sloane, watching this same period unfold from a considerable professional and social distance, made her own decision about her relationship with Phillip, that several people close to her have described as directly connected to everything she had learned that night at the gala. Sloane ended her relationship with Phillip approximately 5 weeks after the gala, in a conversation she has since described not as a response to any single new revelation, but as the conclusion of a slower process of reassessment that the gala had simply accelerated considerably faster than it might otherwise have unfolded. Sloane told a close friend, in an account given some time afterward, that she had realized, in the weeks following the gala, that her relationship with Phillip had been built substantially on a version of his life and his marriage that turned out to be, in important respects, something he had constructed largely through omission and convenient mischaracterization, and that she was no longer certain she could trust his account of anything else in his life either, including his account of his feelings for her. Phillip, in the time since, has remained at his original firm, though several colleagues have described him as noticeably more guarded and less socially confident in professional settings, a change several people who know him have attributed directly to the specific, public nature of how completely his assumptions about his wife's significance had been revealed to be incomplete. Vivian, now over a year removed from the gala and with her divorce from Phillip finalized roughly 8 months earlier, has continued to deepen her involvement with the Larchmont Museum, with the curatorial fellowship program she funded now in its first full year, supporting its inaugural cohort of 3 early career curators whose work Vivian has taken a direct, hands-on mentoring role in. She has remained on the museum's board, continues to chair the acquisitions committee, and has said in limited subsequent comments that the year since the divorce has clarified for her something she had not fully appreciated during the marriage itself, that her sense of purpose and significance had never actually depended on Phillip's recognition of it, even during the years when his lack of curiosity had made that significance feel, to her at the time, somehow smaller or less real than it actually was. Vivian has said the hardest part of the entire experience, in retrospect, was not the gala itself, and not even the divorce, but recognizing how many years she had spent allowing her husband's limited, incurious understanding of her life to shape her own sense of how significant that life actually was. A recalibration she has described as more valuable, ultimately, than anything connected to the marriage's ending specifically. This story gets remembered, when people share it, as a story about a husband who underestimated his wife and watched an entire room silence itself around the consequences. And in one narrow sense, it is that. But I think the more interesting story underneath it is about the specific, slow cost of being genuinely significant in a life that the person closest to you has simply never bothered to fully see. Because Philip's failure was never really about the affair itself, devastating as that was. It was about 17 years of treating his wife's deepest professional and institutional commitments as a pleasant hobby, never once asking the kind of direct, curious questions that might have revealed exactly how substantial and consequential that commitment actually was. And I think what makes this story more than a simple tale of comeuppance is the fact that Vivian's eventual response was never really designed as comeuppance at all. She did not attend that gala to humiliate Philip in front of his colleagues, even though that is, in practice, largely what happened. She attended it because she had every legitimate right to be in that room, built over 2 decades of genuine, substantive work and relationship, and she simply refused to let her own erasure from a guest list change that underlying fact. The room's reaction, the whispered recognition, the silence that fell around Philip and Sloane, all of that happened because the truth, once visible, was simply too significant for the room to ignore, not because Vivian engineered any of it directly. The question this story ultimately leaves you with is not really about revenge or about who deserved what in the eventual divorce. It is about what happens over the slow accumulation of years inside a marriage when one partner's genuine significance goes consistently unexamined by the other, and about the specific, quiet power available to someone who has spent decades building something real, the moment the convenient assumptions built around her finally collide with the truth. There's a photograph from the fellowship program's inaugural welcome reception, taken almost exactly 1 year after the gala. In it, Vivian stands in the American painting wing she funded 6 years earlier, surrounded by the program's first 3 fellows. Mid-conversation, about a painting just out of frame, her expression animated and genuinely engaged in a way several people who know her have said reflects exactly who she has always been, underneath everything the marriage's final years had quietly obscured. She has said it remains her favorite photograph from the entire year, not because of what it represents about the gala or the divorce, but because of how completely unrelated to either of those things the moment actually was. Before we go, I want to ask you something, because I think this story raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer, and I'd rather hear your honest take than offer a tidy one myself. Vivian never set out to humiliate Philip publicly. She simply refused to let an administrative erasure stand uncorrected, and the room did the rest on its own, once the truth became visible. I want to ask you directly, do you think there's a meaningful difference between actively engineering someone's public humiliation and simply, calmly insisting on your own legitimate place in a room, even when the natural consequence of that insistence is someone else's devastating embarrassment? Tell me where you land in the comments. I suspect the answer reveals something about how each of us thinks about the line between dignity and revenge. And if this story made you think about what it actually means to be quietly significant in someone else's life, in ways they may have never fully appreciated, you'll want to see what we're covering next week. Because next week, we're telling the story of 2 business partners, friends for over 20 years, who discovered, only after one of them tried to sell his half of the company, that their original founding agreement had been quietly altered years earlier in a way only one of them had ever known about. Subscribe so you don't miss it. We post a new true story every week. I'm your narrator. This has been Tales of Whisper. You do not always need to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes you only need to walk into the room you already belonged in all along. Tales of Whisper. Storytelling for the curious mind.